For 165 million years, nothing could remove them from the Earth. Not fire, not ice, not poisoned skies, not the slow rearrangement of continents, not even the worst extinction event since life began. And yet one morning, it was over. Before we examine the catastrophe itself, we must begin with something far more unsettling. The calm that preceded it, because extinction does not announce itself with trumpets. It arrives on an ordinary day. 66 million years ago, in the final hour of the Cretaceous, the world was not collapsing. It was alive. A herd of hadrosaurs moved through humid lowlands, tearing at ferns with rhythmic certainty. Their young stayed close, guarded by adults that had inherited survival instincts refined across geological ages. Nearby, a Tyrannosaurus rex, apex predator of a perfected ecosystem, inhaled the dense oxygen-rich air through lungs more efficient than any mammal that would follow. Insects drifted through shafts of amber light. The air carried the scent of resin and wet vegetation. Rivers flowed as they had for millions of years. Nothing in that moment suggested finality. These animals were not relics clinging to a fading world. They were the most successful large terrestrial organisms in the history of life. They had survived the Triassic-Jurassic extinction event. They endured vast volcanic outpourings, fluctuating carbon dioxide levels, oceanic oxygen collapses, and climates that swung from greenhouse heat to polar darkness. They adapted, diversified, and expanded until they occupied every continent. From equatorial floodplains to lands that brushed the Antarctic Circle. They did not merely survive instability. They were shaped by it. Their bodies were masterpieces of biological engineering. Hollow bones threaded with air sacs, growth rates that rival modern birds, metabolic systems that blurred the line between reptile and mammal. Some grew to 70 tons, yet breathed with an efficiency that made gigantism possible. Others evolved feathers long before flight refined them. They nested, migrated, guarded their young. They built empires measured not in decades, but in epochs. For 165 million years, evolution had tested them, and they had answered every trial. And then, on that morning, something changed. High above the atmosphere, beyond sight, a fragment of cosmic debris, older than Earth's forests, older than the dinosaurs themselves, intersected with our planet's orbit. It had traveled silently for hundreds of millions of years. It owed nothing to the ecosystems below. At first, it appeared only as a brightening point in the sky, brighter than Venus, brighter than any star, a white wound opening in daylight. The hadrosaurs continued to graze. The tyrannosaur lifted its head. No species evolves instincts for the unprecedented. How does a dynasty that withstood planetary chaos fall in a single season? How does dominance across 165 million years dissolve in months? Before we confront the violence of that collision, we must ask a deeper question. One that reaches further back in time. What kind of world forges creatures capable of surviving almost everything? And what precisely were they prepared for and unprepared to face? Long before the age of dinosaurs, before the thunder of giant footsteps or the sweep of feathered wings, the Earth came closer to death than at any other time in its history. 252 million years ago, life did not merely suffer. It collapsed. The event we now call the Permian Triassic Extinction event erased nearly 90% of marine species and more than 2/3 of life on land. Coral reefs vanished. Forest ecosystems disintegrated. Entire branches of the tree of life were severed in geological moments. What remained was not a wounded planet, but a stripped one. To understand the rise of the dinosaurs, we must begin here, in silence. The trigger for this catastrophe lay deep beneath what is now northern Asia. Over hundreds of thousands of years, the crust ruptured in titanic pulses, releasing unimaginable volumes of lava across a region we call the Siberian Traps. These were not ordinary eruptions. They were continental-scale fissures pouring molten basalt across millions of square kilometers. The atmosphere thickened with carbon dioxide. Methane, long trapped in frozen sediments, may have escaped in vast quantities. Temperatures surged. Oceans warmed, stratified, and began to suffocate. As oxygen levels fell, marine basins turned toxic. Hydrogen sulfide, lethal even in small concentrations, may have bubbled toward the surface. The chemistry of the oceans altered so profoundly that entire food webs collapsed from the bottom upward. Plankton disappeared. Without plankton, there were no reefs. Without reefs, no shelter for countless species. Life imploded. On land, forests that had stood for tens of millions of years withered. Charcoal deposits suggest wildfires raged across continents. Soil erosion stripped landscapes bare. Rivers choked with sediment. Insects, amphibians, synapsids, most vanished. It was not a single blow. It was a long suffocation. For perhaps 5 million years, the Earth struggled to recover. Ecosystems were simplified to a degree almost unimaginable today. Instead of rich, layered communities, there were sparse assemblages of opportunists. The world was hot, unstable, chemically volatile. Oxygen levels fluctuated, carbon cycles lurched unpredictably, and yet life did not end. In this devastated world, a lineage quietly endured. Among the scattered survivors were early archosaurs, a group of reptiles that would one day give rise to crocodiles, pterosaurs, and dinosaurs. At this stage, they were neither dominant nor especially large. They did not rule the landscape. They were simply present. But presence in such a world was everything. What distinguished these archosaurs was not brute strength. It was architecture. Their limbs were positioned more directly beneath their bodies, allowing a more energy-efficient gait than the sprawling posture of many contemporaries. Their ankle joints were structured for sustained locomotion. Some evidence suggests increasingly efficient respiratory systems, precursors to the air sac networks that would later define dinosaurs and birds. These were subtle advantages in stable times. In unstable times, they were decisive. The post-extinction world demanded endurance. It demanded the ability to travel farther between food sources to cope with heat stress, to survive in ecosystems that collapsed and reassembled unpredictably. It rewarded flexibility over specialization. Dinosaurs did not emerge fully formed from the ashes. They evolved gradually within this archosaur radiation during the Triassic. But the conditions that shaped them were already in place. The catastrophe had reset ecological hierarchies. Dominant synapsids that once held power were diminished. Niches lay vacant, evolution experiments where stability once constrained it. We often imagine prehistoric worlds as static backdrops for monstrous creatures. The reality was far more dynamic. The Earth after the Permian was a laboratory of survival under extreme constraint. Atmospheric composition shifted. Continental configurations continued to rearrange. Volcanism simmered in the background. Every lineage alive during this period existed on probation. The ancestors of dinosaurs were not sculpted in comfort. They were refined in volatility. And there is something deeply instructive in that. When environments are stable, evolution optimizes. It polishes organisms for efficiency within narrow bounds. But when environments become chaotic, optimization becomes a liability. Specialists perish, generalists endure. Systems that can absorb shock outlast those that cannot. The archosaurs that would eventually produce dinosaurs embodied this resilience. Upright posture reduced energy expenditure over distance. Improved lung capacity increased oxygen extraction in fluctuating atmospheres. Faster growth rates may have enabled quicker recovery from population crashes. None of these traits guaranteed dominance, but together they formed a platform for expansion once stability tentatively returned. By the early Triassic, ecosystems were still sparse. The world remained harsh, with equatorial regions perhaps too hot for sustained habitation during peak warming. Recovery was slow, painfully slow, yet through millions of years life diversified again. New predator-prey relationships formed, plants recolonized denuded landscapes, insects radiated. From this long convalescence, the stage was set. Dinosaurs would not appear for another 20 million years. When they did, they would begin as minor players among many reptilian competitors. But their origin story was written in catastrophe. They were the inheritors of a world that had already nearly ended once. This matters because it reframes everything that follows. The dinosaurs were not born into abundance. They did not arise in a golden age. Their lineage was tested before it was triumphant. The planetary systems that shaped them were unstable, extreme, and unforgiving. And those pressures selected for traits that would later allow them to withstand further upheavals. Volcanic winters, climatic swings, continental breakup, ocean crises. They were in a very real sense forged in apocalypse, but survival after one extinction does not guarantee survival after all. If the Earth itself had nearly suffocated, if oceans had turned poisonous and forests had burned, and yet life endured, what precise combination of traits allowed these early archosaurs to persist while so many others vanished? And more importantly, were those same traits destined one day to meet a challenge they could not overcome? 20 million years after the greatest extinction in Earth's history, the planet had not found peace. It had found tension. The continents were still fused into the vast supercontinent Pangaea, a single colossal landmass stretching from pole to pole. Its interior was harsh and seasonal, dominated by long droughts and punishing heat. Life had returned, but it lived cautiously. Ecosystems were rebuilding themselves in fragile layers, like a forest growing over the scar of a wildfire. Then, approximately 234 million years ago, the sky changed. What we now call the Carnian pluvial episode began not with fire but with water. For nearly 2 million years, rainfall intensified across much of the globe. Arid interiors gave way to humid floodplains. River systems swelled. Sediments washed into basins in thick pulses. The evidence lies in rock layers once thought ordinary, now understood as records of relentless precipitation. This was not a gentle monsoon. It was planetary rehydration. The cause appears linked to vast volcanic eruptions in what is now Western North America, part of a province known as Rungelia. These eruptions released enormous quantities of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Greenhouse warming followed. Warmer air holds more moisture. And so the hydrological cycle accelerated. Rain fell on landscapes that had been dry for millions of years. At first glance, rain suggests renewal, but ecological systems adapted to aridity can collapse when drowned. Plant communities shifted rapidly. Some flourished in the moisture, others vanished. Riverbanks eroded, soils destabilized, food webs rearranged themselves once more. Each climatic upheaval acts as a filter. Species suited to one regime falter when the regime changes. And in the Triassic, change was relentless. At this time, dinosaurs were not yet rulers. They were marginal, small, lightly built, scattered among a far more diverse assemblage of reptiles. Dominant predators included Rauisuchians, formidable archosaurs with massive skulls and crushing jaws. Other herbivorous reptiles occupied ecological niches that dinosaurs would later claim. Dinosaurs were present, but they were not yet significant. And yet, within their anatomy, there were signs of a quiet advantage. Their limbs were positioned directly beneath the body, allowing efficient, sustained locomotion. Their hips were structured in ways that permitted dynamic movement. Most importantly, their respiratory systems were evolving toward a design that would later define birds. A system of air sacs that allowed continuous airflow through the lungs, extracting oxygen with extraordinary efficiency. In a world of fluctuating oxygen levels and unstable climates, such efficiency mattered. Metabolism, too, may have been shifting. Evidence from bone histology suggests that early dinosaurs grew quickly. Rapid growth implies high energy turnover. High energy turnover allows for greater ecological flexibility. The ability to exploit resources rapidly when they appear and recover quickly after disturbance. These were not towering giants yet. They were small, alert, adaptable. Among them was Eoraptor, a lightly built animal discovered in Argentina's Isquigualasto Formation. Roughly the size of a large dog, it possessed a blend of primitive and derived traits. Its teeth suggest an opportunistic diet, perhaps omnivorous. It was not specialized, it did not dominate, it endured. And endurance in the Carnian world was the essential currency. As rainfall intensified, plant communities transformed. New groups of flora began to spread, including early relatives of modern conifers. With them came new herbivorous opportunities. Insects diversified. Small vertebrates adapted to wetter habitats. The ecological chessboard was rearranging itself once more. Every extinction event, even minor ones, opened space. The Carnian pluvial episode may not rank among the big five mass extinctions, but it reshaped ecosystems profoundly. Several groups of previously dominant reptiles declined during this interval. In their wake, dinosaurs began to diversify, not explosively, not dramatically, but persistently. Their anatomical advantages, upright gait, efficient respiration, rapid growth, did not guarantee supremacy. They provided resilience, and resilience, when layered across generations, accumulates into dominance. Imagine living in a world where climate regimes swing across millennia, where volcanic gases alter atmospheric chemistry, where rainfall transforms deserts into wetlands and then recedes again. In such a world, survival depends not on perfection but on tolerance, the ability to function across a range of conditions. Dinosaurs were developing precisely that tolerance. By the time the Carnian rains subsided, the world did not return to its previous equilibrium. Instability remained embedded in Earth's systems. Volcanism would continue. Continental rifting would begin to tear Pangaea apart. Atmospheric composition would fluctuate again. The rain ended, but the testing did not. And as the Triassic progressed, the selective pressures that had begun in the Permian and intensified during the Carnian would converge towards something even more severe. The dinosaurs had crossed a threshold. They were no longer mere survivors in someone else's ecosystem. They were participants in a planetary experiment that rewarded adaptability over brute force. Yet one question lingers. If rainfall, volcanism, and ecological collapse could be endured, if minor extinctions could be navigated, what would happen when the next upheaval was not gradual but sudden? Because the Triassic was not finished with them. 200 million years ago, the planet began to crack open, and most life did not survive the pressure. By the late Triassic, dinosaurs had endured drought, flood, and instability. They had crossed climatic thresholds that erased stronger, more specialized competitors. But their true trial had not yet arrived. It began beneath the surface. Deep below what is now the Atlantic Ocean, the crust stretched and thinned as the supercontinent Pangaea started to pull apart. That tension unleashed one of the most colossal volcanic outpourings in Earth's history, the Central Atlantic Magmatic Province. For hundreds of thousands of years, fissures tore across thousands of kilometers. Lava did not erupt as isolated mountains. It flooded outward in sheets. Basalt covered vast regions of what are now North America, South America, Africa, and Europe. Each eruption injected enormous quantities of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. The greenhouse effect intensified rapidly. oceans absorbed the excess CO2, becoming more acidic. Global temperatures rose, weather patterns destabilized. Methane may have been released from ocean sediments, amplifying the warming further. The atmosphere grew heavy with volcanic gases. Then ecosystems began to fail. This was the Triassic-Jurassic extinction event, one of the 5 great mass extinctions. It erased an estimated 70 to 75% of species on Earth. The giants of the Triassic, Rauisuchians, towering crocodile-line archosaurs that had dominated terrestrial predator niches, vanished. Massive amphibians that lurked in river systems disappeared. Many armored herbivorous reptiles were gone. Marine reptiles suffered heavy losses. Coral reefs collapsed. The food webs that had reassembled after the Permian were dismantled again. This was not a selective pruning. It was a systemic breakdown. And yet, dinosaurs did not disappear. They were affected. Populations shrank. Lineages were lost. But the clade as a whole endured. When the ash settled and the lava cooled, dinosaurs remained in ecosystems that had been emptied of their former rulers. Why? The answer does not lie in strength. It lies in design. Dinosaurs possessed respiratory systems that allowed more efficient oxygen extraction. In periods of atmospheric fluctuation, this was a decisive edge. Their upright posture reduced energy expenditure during locomotion. They could travel farther, hunt longer, migrate if necessary. Their growth rates suggest metabolic systems capable of rapid development, enabling quicker reproductive cycles and faster population recovery after catastrophe. They were generalists in a world that punished specialists. Among the survivors was Chelophysis, slender, lightweight, and swift. Fossils from what is now New Mexico reveal groups of these animals preserved together, hinting at social behavior or at least tolerance of proximity. Coelophysis was not massive. It was not armored. It did not possess crushing jaws or towering height. It possessed speed, flexibility, opportunism. Its narrow skull and sharp teeth suggest a varied diet, small vertebrates, insects, perhaps carrion. In an ecosystem recovering from collapse, such adaptability was invaluable. When one food source vanished, another could be pursued. This is the quiet truth of survival across extinction boundaries. Dominance is fragile, specialization is brittle, but flexibility endures. When large competitors vanished during the Triassic-Jurassic crisis, ecological niches did not remain empty for long. Dinosaurs expanded into them. Herbivorous lineages grew larger. Predatory forms diversified. The first true giants would soon emerge in the Jurassic. It was not that dinosaurs conquered the Earth in a dramatic uprising. The Earth cleared the stage. The extinction event functioned like a planetary reset. The dominant crocodile-line archosaurs that had once suppressed dinosaur expansion were gone. Amphibian megafauna that controlled aquatic systems were reduced. Competition thinned, and dinosaurs stepped forward. Within a few million years, they transformed from secondary players into primary architects of terrestrial ecosystems. By the early Jurassic, they were the unquestioned rulers of land environments across much of the globe. But their rise was inseparable from catastrophe. Every great leap in their history followed environmental trauma. The Permian extinction opened evolutionary space. The Carnian rains reshuffled ecosystems. The Triassic-Jurassic apocalypse removed their largest rivals. Each trial refined them. And now, as Pangaea continued to fracture, another transformation loomed. Slower than an impact, but no less profound. The continents were beginning to tear apart. Rift valleys deepened. Oceans would soon flood between land masses that had once been joined. Climate zones would diversify. Isolation would accelerate evolution. Entire dinosaur lineages would diverge simply because oceans stood between them. The world was about to become fragmented, and in that fragmentation lay both opportunity and danger. because the same tectonic forces that birthed the Atlantic would reshape climate, ocean currents, and ecosystems for the next 135 million years. The dinosaurs had survived their first great trial. Now they would have to thrive on a planet in motion. At their peak, some dinosaurs outweighed a herd of modern elephants, and yet their bones were laced with air. After surviving the inferno of the Triassic-Jurassic extinction, dinosaurs did not merely persist, they expanded into a transformed world. The supercontinent Pangaea continued to split apart, carving new coastlines and birthing shallow seas. Climates grew more humid in many regions during the early and middle Jurassic. Lush vegetation spread across floodplains. Conifer forests rose tall. Fern prairies stretched across lowlands. The stage was no longer defined by survival alone. It was defined by opportunity. And in this widening ecological theater, dinosaurs began to experiment with size on a scale never before attempted by land animals. The Jurassic was the age of the sauropods. Early forms had appeared in the late Triassic, but now they flourished, diversifying into lineages that would become the largest terrestrial animals in Earth's history. Among them was Diplodocus, a creature of astonishing proportions. Its neck extended like a living crane, its tail lashed like a counterbalance whip, and its body stretched longer than a city bus. It moved in herds across vast floodplains, harvesting vegetation with peg-like teeth. Yet Diplodocus was only a chapter in a much larger story. Much later in the Cretaceous, titanosaurs would push size even further. Argentinosaurus is estimated to have reached lengths of over 30 meters and weights approaching 70 metric tons. A land animal heavier than a space shuttle. 70 tons. The question is not simply how such mass was possible. The question is how it functioned. Size on that scale presents brutal biological challenges. Gravity does not negotiate. Muscles must support immense weight. Hearts must pump blood up vertical necks several meters long. Lungs must oxygenate tissue deep within colossal bodies. Bones must resist catastrophic stress fractures. Evolution answered these problems not with brute reinforcement, but with elegant engineering. Sauropod skeletons were not solid. Many bones were pneumatized, hollowed out and infiltrated by air sacs connected to the respiratory system. This design reduced weight without sacrificing strength, much like the internal struts of modern aircraft wings. The vertebrae of large sauropods were intricate lattices of bone and air, minimizing mass while preserving structural integrity. Their respiratory systems were even more remarkable. Unlike mammals, which move air in and out of lungs through tidal breathing, sauropods inherited from earlier theropod ancestors a system of air sacs that allowed continuous, one-directional airflow. Fresh, oxygenated air passed through the lungs even during exhalation. This design is preserved today in birds. It is extraordinarily efficient. In mammals, inhaled air mixes with residual stale air. In birds, and likely in sauropods, airflow functions almost like a bellows system, maintaining a constant stream of oxygen across respiratory surfaces. Respiratory efficiency beyond mammals. In a 70-ton body, oxygen delivery is everything. Muscles require it, organs demand it, growth depends on it. An air sac system distributed throughout the body cavity would have acted not only as a breathing apparatus, but as a thermal regulator, dissipating heat from an enormous core. Heat management is a silent enemy of gigantism. Large bodies retain warmth. Without effective cooling systems, metabolic activity becomes self-limiting. Air sacs provided both oxygen and internal ventilation. And then there were the teeth. Sauropods did not chew in the mammalian sense. Many species stripped vegetation and swallowed it largely unprocessed, relying on gut fermentation to break down plant matter. Teeth wore down rapidly under such strain. The solution was not durability, it was replacement. Continuous tooth replacement. Some sauropods carried dozens of replacement teeth queued beneath each functional one. When a tooth wore out or broke, another rotated into place. This conveyor belt of dentition ensured uninterrupted feeding, a necessity for animals that required vast quantities of plant matter daily. Imagine the metabolic equation. An animal weighing tens of thousands of kilograms must consume hundreds of kilograms of vegetation each day. Energy intake must exceed the immense baseline cost of simply existing. Here, evolutionary engineering becomes visible. Long necks allowed wide feeding arcs without moving the entire body, conserving energy. Herd behavior may have provided protection for juveniles. Rapid growth rates reduced vulnerability windows. Pneumatized bones lowered skeletal mass. Efficient lungs maximized oxygen extraction. Tooth batteries ensured constant feeding capability. Each adaptation alone is impressive. Together they formed a system. This is mastery of the environment, not through aggression, but through optimization. The Jurassic world was not empty of predators. Large theropods stalked the same floodplains, yet adult sauropods, once fully grown, had few natural enemies. Their sheer size was deterrent enough. A single sweep of a muscular tail could shatter bone. Their mass alone rendered them nearly invulnerable. But gigantism is a double-edged strategy. Large animals reproduce more slowly. They require stable food supplies. They are sensitive to ecological disruption. If vegetation declines, a small herbivore may migrate or adapt to alternate diets. A 70-ton grazer cannot pivot so easily. Size creates dominance. It also creates dependence. During the Jurassic, ecosystems were productive. Atmospheric carbon dioxide levels were higher than today, encouraging plant growth in warm climates. Continents drifting apart created extensive shallow seas, moderating global temperatures and supporting diverse habitats. For tens of millions of years, the system worked. Sauropods spread across nearly every continent. Fossils have been found in North America, South America, Africa, Europe, and Asia. They diversified into multiple families, experimenting with neck lengths, body proportions, and feeding strategies. They became living architecture, moving towers of flesh and bone, reshaping landscapes simply by eating. Forests thinned where herds passed. Seeds were dispersed in massive quantities. Nutrient cycles were altered by the digestion and redistribution of plant matter. Their footprints pressed deep into soft sediment, leaving impressions that would fossilize for hundreds of millions of years. They were not just inhabitants of ecosystems. They were engineers of them, and yet their very success rested on conditions that could shift. Continental drift continued. Ocean circulation patterns evolved. Volcanism persisted in different regions. Atmospheric chemistry fluctuated over geological timescales. The Jurassic was generous, but Earth is rarely static. Gigantism thrives in abundance. It falters in scarcity. As the Jurassic gave way to the Cretaceous, new plant groups began to emerge, including the first flowering plants. Herbivore communities adapted. Predator lineages diversified. Titanosaurs would carry sauropod gigantism into new territories, even as other sauropod families declined. The system was dynamic, always adjusting. But somewhere beyond the horizon of this long success, forces were aligning that did not care about engineering elegance. Air sacs cannot filter global darkness. Hollow bones cannot outrun planetary winter. Continuous tooth replacement cannot feed a body when photosynthesis collapses. For millions of years, evolutionary innovation had pushed dinosaurs toward ever greater scale. They had mastered gravity, respiration, and growth. They had turned anatomy into architecture. But mastery breeds exposure. Because the larger the organism, the more deeply it is tied to the stability of its world. And stability on Earth is always temporary. Something was already in motion, far beyond the drifting continents and volcanic provinces. a remnant from the formation of the solar system orbiting silently, crossing paths with Earth on a timetable indifferent to biology. Size had made the dinosaurs powerful. What happens when power meets inevitability? What do you think about this? Share your thoughts in the comments section and subscribe to our channel for more content. The oceans began to lose their breath. Long before the final catastrophe that would end the age of dinosaurs, Earth rehearsed a quieter kind of devastation. It did not arrive as fire from the sky or lava from the depths. It arrived as absence, the slow, suffocating disappearance of oxygen from the seas. During the Jurassic and Cretaceous periods, the planet experienced repeated episodes now known as oceanic anoxic events. In these intervals, vast portions of the world's oceans became depleted of dissolved oxygen. Seafloors that once teemed with burrowing organisms fell silent. Organic matter that would normally decay accumulated in dark layers, preserved as black shales that geologists now read like warning letters from the past. The water did not vanish, life within it did. These anoxic events were driven by complex feedback loops. Elevated volcanic activity and shifting continental configurations altered atmospheric carbon dioxide levels. Warmer global temperatures reduced the ability of oceans to hold oxygen. Increased rainfall in some regions washed nutrients into the seas, fueling massive plankton blooms. When those plankton died, their decomposition consumed enormous quantities of oxygen in deeper waters. The surface shimmered with life. The depths starved. One of the most severe of these crises unfolded during the early Cretaceous, an interval often referred to as Oceanic Anoxic Event 1A. Later, near the boundary between the Cenomanian and Turonian stages, another powerful pulse struck, Oceanic Anoxic Event 2. In sedimentary basins around the world, thick deposits of dark, carbon-rich rock marked these suffocations. Marine ecosystems destabilized repeatedly. Reefs suffered, ammonites declined and rebounded in cycles, fish lineages contracted. The great marine reptiles, ichthyosaurs and some plesiosaurs, faced mounting ecological pressure. Food chains that depended on stable plankton communities faltered as primary productivity swung between boom and collapse. When oxygen vanishes from the base of a food web, the collapse radiates upward. The oceans, which cover more than 70% of Earth's surface, are not peripheral to planetary stability. They regulate climate, store carbon, and generate much of the oxygen in the atmosphere through photosynthesis. When marine systems destabilize, the effects ripple globally. Yet something remarkable happened. While the seas struggled, terrestrial ecosystems remained comparatively buffered. Forests did not collapse wholesale. River systems continued to run. Dinosaurs did not experience extinction on the scale seen in the oceans. There were regional shifts, certainly, turnover in species, migration patterns altered by climate swings. But the great terrestrial dynasties endured. Why? Part of the answer lies in structural separation. The oceans operate under different physical constraints than land. Stratified water columns can trap deep layers away from atmospheric mixing, allowing oxygen depletion to intensify unnoticed from above. On land, atmospheric circulation distributes gases more freely. Even during periods of high carbon dioxide, oxygen in the air remained sufficient to sustain large vertebrates. But there is another factor: adaptability across climate gradients. By the mid-Cretaceous, dinosaurs occupied nearly every viable terrestrial habitat on Earth. They roamed equatorial floodplains, temperate forests, arid interiors, and, most surprisingly, polar regions. Evidence from what is now Antarctica reveals that dinosaurs lived within the Antarctic Circle during parts of the Cretaceous. Fossils of ornithopods and small theropods have been uncovered in rocks that were once situated at high southern latitudes. At the time, the continent was not buried beneath ice as it is today, but it still experienced prolonged seasonal darkness. Similarly, in what is now Alaska, the Prince Creek Formation has yielded remains of hadrosaurs, ceratopsians, and small carnivorous dinosaurs. These animals endured months without sunlight each year. Even in warmer global climates, polar winters meant extended periods of low light and cooler temperatures. Darkness tests physiology. Plants slow their growth. Primary productivity drops. Herbivores must adapt to seasonal scarcity. Predators follow prey into harsher conditions. The presence of dinosaurs in these regions suggests flexibility in metabolism and behavior. Some may have migrated seasonally. Others likely overwintered, enduring cold and limited food supplies. Bone histology studies indicate relatively rapid growth rates and possibly elevated metabolic activity compared to modern reptiles. Insulation in the form of feathers or filamentous coverings in some lineages would have aided temperature regulation. They were not confined to equatorial warmth. While marine reptiles contended with collapsing oxygen zones beneath the waves, dinosaurs on land experimented with life at the edges of habitability. This buffering did not mean immunity. Climate swings associated with oceanic anoxic events altered rainfall patterns and vegetation on land. Carbon dioxide fluctuations influenced plant communities. Flowering plants, the angiosperms, began diversifying rapidly during the Cretaceous, reshaping herbivore diets and ecological interactions. Evolution accelerated in response to instability. New predator-prey dynamics emerged. Insects co-evolved with flowering plants. Herbivorous dinosaurs adapted their feeding strategies. Hadrosaurs developed complex dental batteries capable of processing tougher vegetation. Ceratopsians diversified in form and ornamentation. Theropods experimented with feathers, flight-related anatomy, and refined sensory systems. The planet was not collapsing, it was transforming. The ocean's near suffocation served as a planetary stress test. Systems that were rigid fractured. Systems that were modular, diverse, and geographically widespread endured. Dinosaurs, by this stage, were not a single monolithic group. They were an expansive radiation of forms, from titanic sauropods to small, feathered hunters. Geographic isolation due to continental drift fostered diversification. Africa's faunas differed from those of Asia. South America's titanosaurs evolved distinct lineages. North America developed its own unique assemblages. Diversity itself became a survival mechanism. If one region suffered drought, another flourished. If one lineage declined, another expanded. The evolutionary tree grew branches faster than they could be pruned. Meanwhile, the black shales accumulated quietly in the ocean basins, recording the episodes when life below the surface nearly suffocated. The irony is stark. The realm that had first given rise to complex life, the sea, became periodically hostile to it, and the descendants of small Triassic survivors, once marginal land dwellers, now thrived above. But the acceleration carried consequences. Rapid diversification means rapid experimentation, new body plans, new metabolic demands, new ecological dependencies. The faster evolution moves, the more tightly intertwined systems can become. Specialization increases alongside diversity. Flowering plants spread across continents, altering carbon cycles and atmospheric chemistry. Insects diversified explosively in response. Herbivores tracked plant innovations. Predators tracked herbivores. The web thickened. And with complexity comes fragility. The oceans had demonstrated how quickly foundational systems could tip into collapse. On land, the machinery of life was running faster than ever before. Giant herbivores shaped landscapes. Apex predators refined hunting strategies. Small feathered theropods edged closer to powered flight. Evolution was no longer crawling through geological time. It was surging. Continents continued to drift. Sea levels rose and fell. Volcanic provinces pulsed intermittently. Asteroids still crossed Earth's orbit, unseen and indifferent. The dinosaurs had survived drought, flood, fire, and suffocation at sea. They had colonized the poles. They had engineered bodies that mastered gravity and respiration. They had diversified into forms so varied that they seemed untouchable. But acceleration is not stability. When change compounds upon change, systems can become exquisitely tuned and exquisitely vulnerable. The oceans had almost killed everything through silence. The land for now remained vibrant, yet beneath the rising diversity, beneath the flowering forests and roaming herds, forces were converging toward a threshold no lineage had ever faced. Evolution was accelerating, and acceleration always approaches a breaking point. By the late Cretaceous, the world no longer belonged to the ancient forests of conifers alone. A quiet botanical revolution had taken root, and it would transform everything that followed. Flowering plants, angiosperms, began spreading across continents with astonishing speed. Their strategy was different from the gymnosperms that had dominated earlier eras. They reproduced through flowers and fruit, forming intricate partnerships with insects and other animals. Seeds were enclosed, protected, and often dispersed deliberately rather than scattered blindly on the wind. Forests became more complex. Understories thickened. Seasonal blooms reshaped landscapes with bursts of color and nutrition. Insects diversified alongside them, co-evolving in a dance of pollination and reward. The structure of ecosystems shifted from top to bottom. Dinosaurs did not merely observe this transformation, they adapted to it. Herbivorous lineages evolved more sophisticated feeding mechanisms to process new plant tissues. Dental batteries grew more intricate. Jaw mechanics became more refined. Social behavior appears to have intensified as herds navigated increasingly heterogeneous landscapes. In North America, one of the most iconic beneficiaries of this botanical shift roamed the floodplains and coastal lowlands, Triceratops. Its massive skull bore 3 horns and a broad frill, a structure once imagined as purely defensive but now understood as potentially multifunctional. Display, species recognition, thermoregulation. Its beaked mouth clipped vegetation efficiently while rows of tightly packed teeth formed grinding surfaces capable of processing tough plant material. Triceratops did not wander alone. Fossil assemblages suggest that ceratopsians often moved in groups. Trackways indicate coordinated movement. Bone beds preserve multiple individuals of varying ages, hinting at structured herds rather than accidental gatherings. Herding is not a primitive behavior. It requires communication, memory, and social tolerance. It implies shared vigilance against predators and coordinated migration between feeding grounds. It suggests learning passed from one generation to the next. Across the same landscapes, an apex predator refined its dominance to surgical precision. Tyrannosaurus rex. Massive skull. Forward-facing eyes, serrated teeth the size of bananas, bite forces among the strongest ever measured in a terrestrial animal. Yet even Tyrannosaurus rex was not the sluggish reptile once depicted in early illustrations. Bone histology reveals rapid growth rates, especially during adolescence. The proportions of its limbs suggest bursts of speed despite its size. Its brain case indicates well-developed sensory regions, particularly for smell and vision. This was not a cold-blooded relic. It was a metabolically active predator operating in a complex, dynamic ecosystem. By this stage in their history, feathers were not anomalies confined to obscure lineages. Evidence from China, Mongolia, and beyond shows that feathers, or filamentous protofeathers, were widespread among theropods. Some species bore elaborate plumage, possibly for display or insulation. Even large-bodied forms may have retained patches of feathers, especially during juvenile stages. Feathers are not reptilian. They are insulation, communication, aerodynamics. They imply regulation of internal temperature and sophisticated behavioral signaling. Combined with rapid growth rates and bone vascularization patterns, they reinforce a view of many dinosaurs as warm-blooded or at least metabolically elevated compared to modern reptiles. The caricature dissolves. Instead of sluggish swamp dwellers, we see energetic animals navigating intricate food webs, raising young, forming social groups, and adapting to rapidly shifting plant communities. The work of paleontologist John R. Horner provided profound insight into this social dimension. In Montana's Two Medicine Formation, he uncovered evidence of nesting colonies attributed to hadrosaurs. Multiple nests arranged in close proximity, eggs preserved in clusters, hatchlings and juveniles found together in growth stages suggesting extended parental care. These were not isolated eggs abandoned to chance. They were communities. Juvenile bones revealed growth rings indicating sustained development within protected environments. Some young dinosaurs appear to have remained in nesting grounds long enough to require provisioning or at least protection by adults. The parallels to modern bird colonies are striking. Complex herding and nesting behaviors imply something deeper: neurological sophistication, memory, social structure, possibly vocal communication. The Cretaceous was not simply the age of giants, it was the age of behavioral refinement. Predators tracked herd movements, herbivores navigated seasonal blooms of flowering plants, small feathered theropods experimented with gliding and powered flight. One lineage would eventually cross a boundary that no other dinosaur lineage did, taking to the skies permanently as birds. Meanwhile, continental drift continued to sculpt geography. South America drifted farther from Africa. India moved northward as an isolated island continent. Sea levels fluctuated, creating inland seas that divided populations and encouraged regional specialization. Isolation breeds innovation. Ceratopsians flourished in North America and Asia. Titanosaurs dominated parts of South America. Abelisaur predators developed distinctive skull morphologies in Gondwanan regions. Diversity peaked. The Cretaceous ecosystem was layered and dynamic. Flowering plants fueled herbivore diversification. Herbivores supported large predator guilds. Insects, birds, small mammals, and marine reptiles added complexity at every level. Dinosaurs were no longer merely survivors of catastrophe. They were architects of a living, breathing planet. And yet the very success of this revolution carried inherent tension. The more intricate a system becomes, the more pathways exist for disruption. Flowering plants altered carbon cycles. Rapid diversification increased specialization. Large-bodied herbivores depended on stable vegetation patterns. Apex predators depended on abundant prey. The network tightened. On a planetary scale, geological forces did not rest. Deep beneath the Indian subcontinent, magma was gathering in vast reservoirs. Tectonic stresses built silently. Mantle plumes rose, pressurizing the crust from below. The surface world, alive with color and motion, had no awareness of what stirred beneath it. Forests bloomed, herds migrated, tyrannosaurs hunted along riverbanks. Nesting colonies returned season after season to familiar grounds. Feathers flashed in courtship displays. Hatchlings broke from shells under watchful adults. At their peak, dinosaurs seemed untouchable, diversified across continents, metabolically dynamic, behaviorally complex. They had weathered mass extinctions, oceanic suffocations, climate swings, and tectonic upheavals. They had transformed themselves from marginal Triassic survivors into the dominant terrestrial vertebrates of the planet. But evolution does not grant permanence. Beneath the Indian plate, pressure mounted. Deep fissures prepared to open. Lava would soon flood across landscapes in volumes rivaling the great eruptions of the Triassic. Atmospheric chemistry would shift again, climate would destabilize, and beyond Earth's atmosphere, another force traced its ancient orbit. At their moment of greatest sophistication, when flowering forests flourished and feathered dynamos ruled the land, something beneath the Earth began to stir. Long before the sky burned, the ground was already on fire. In the final million years of the Cretaceous, as herds of horned dinosaurs moved across flowering plains and tyrannosaurs patrolled river valleys, the Indian subcontinent was drifting northward in isolation. It was an island continent separated from Asia by vast stretches of ocean. Beneath it, something immense was building pressure. A mantle plume, a rising column of superheated rock from deep within the Earth, pressed upward against the crust. When it finally breached the surface, it did not produce a single volcano. It produced an eruption on a continental scale. The Deccan Traps began pouring lava across western India approximately 66 million years ago. Layer upon layer of basalt spread outward, each flow hardening before the next buried it. Over time, the accumulated lava would cover more than 500,000 square kilometers, with an original volume likely exceeding 1 million cubic kilometers. This was not an isolated explosion. It was a prolonged convulsion. Each eruptive pulse injected vast quantities of carbon dioxide and sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide trapped heat, driving warming episodes. Sulfur aerosols reflected sunlight, triggering short-term cooling. The climate began to oscillate, warming, then dimming, then warming again, in rapid geological succession. Ecosystems thrive on predictability. The Deccan eruptions delivered volatility. Acid rain fell as sulfur compounds combined with atmospheric moisture. Soils were leached of nutrients. Freshwater systems experienced chemical stress. Forests endured cycles of drought and deluge as atmospheric circulation patterns shifted. In the oceans, the story grew darker still. Carbon dioxide dissolved into seawater, forming carbonic acid. Ocean chemistry tilted toward acidification. Planktonic organisms that built calcium carbonate shells struggled as the saturation state of carbonate ions declined. When plankton falter, the entire marine food web trembles. Geological records show that marine communities were under strain in the late Cretaceous. Certain groups of foraminifera declined. Coral ecosystems exhibited stress signals. Some ammonite lineages thinned before their final disappearance. Was this the beginning of the end? This question remains one of the most debated in paleontology. Some researchers argue that dinosaurs were already experiencing gradual decline before the final catastrophe. Fossil diversity in certain regions appears to decrease in the latest Cretaceous layers. Herbivore communities show shifts in composition. Predator-prey ratios fluctuate. Others counter that the fossil record is uneven and geographically biased. Rock exposures from the final million years are limited. Apparent declines may reflect gaps in sampling rather than genuine biological contraction. In well-preserved formations like the Held Creek of North America, dinosaur diversity appears robust right up to the boundary. The debate persists because the evidence is complex. Climate proxies extracted from marine sediments indicate temperature swings coinciding with major eruptive phases of the Deccan. Some models suggest pulses of volcanic activity may have caused short-term cooling episodes, severe enough to disrupt ecosystems regionally. Other models emphasize long-term warming from sustained carbon dioxide release. Acid rain would have stressed plant communities. Even flowering plants, resilient and adaptable, have limits to soil chemistry shifts. Large herbivorous dinosaurs required immense daily caloric intake. Fluctuating plant productivity could ripple upward quickly. Yet dinosaurs had survived volcanic crises before. The Central Atlantic magmatic province had nearly ended life in the Triassic, and dinosaurs had emerged stronger. Why should this event be different? Perhaps because the Cretaceous world was more interconnected and more specialized. Angiosperms had woven intricate ecological networks with insects and herbivores. Predator guilds were finely balanced. Continental positions shaped ocean currents that regulated climate. When the Deccan traps pulsed, the effects were not confined to a single biome. Ash and gases circled the globe. Atmospheric chemistry shifted at planetary scale. Some studies propose that the most intense phase of volcanism may have clustered close to the very end of the Cretaceous, amplifying environmental instability at a critical moment. Other researchers suggest the largest eruptive pulses may have occurred slightly before the final extinction event, allowing ecosystems some degree of recovery before the ultimate blow. The timing matters. If volcanic stress had already pushed ecosystems to the edge, then any additional shock could have tipped them irreversibly. If, however, ecosystems remained broadly resilient, then volcanism alone may not explain the sudden and global nature of the mass extinction that followed. Marine sediments show signs of warming spikes and chemical perturbations in the final hundreds of thousands of years. On land, pollen records indicate regional plant turnover. Some vertebrate assemblages exhibit subtle shifts in species abundance, but there is no unanimous signal of catastrophic collapse prior to the boundary layer that marks the end. Dinosaurs still nested, herds still migrated, tyrannosaurs still hunted, titanosaurs still browsed in Gondwanan landscapes. The world was stressed, yes, but alive. It is possible that the Deccan eruptions acted like a chronic illness rather than an immediate fatal wound. Repeated climatic oscillations could weaken ecosystems gradually, reducing resilience. Acid rain might thin forests over time. Ocean acidification could reduce plankton productivity, narrowing food chains from the base upward. Stress accumulates invisibly until it does not, yet it is equally plausible that life, as it had so many times before, was adjusting. Angiosperms continued diversifying. Mammals were radiating quietly in ecological shadows. Dinosaurs showed no universal signs of imminent extinction. The scientific community remains divided not because of ignorance, but because the data can be interpreted in multiple coherent ways. Radiometric dating of lava flows continues to refine timelines. Geochemical analysis of sediments yields new insights into atmospheric composition. Climate models grow more sophisticated. The story is still being written. What is certain is this. By the final moments of the Cretaceous, Earth was already unsettled. The Deccan traps had been burning. The air had carried volcanic gases. Rain had fallen acidic in some regions. The oceans had absorbed pulses of carbon dioxide. Climate had swung between warmth and chill. The biosphere was not at peace. And then, as India's lava plains smoldered and the planet adjusted yet again to internal upheaval, something approached from a direction no organism could anticipate. It had been orbiting the sun for millions of years, a fragment left over from planetary formation. Its path intersected Earth's at precisely the wrong moment. The volcanoes were already burning. Then came something from beyond Earth. Be ready for shocking revelations about nature coming next. By the final days of the Maastrichtian, the world of the dinosaurs was a tapestry of abundance and complexity. The great river plains of North America were alive with the shuffling movement of herds. Edmontosaurus grazed in dense numbers along coastal lowlands, feeding on a diverse buffet of angiosperms and conifers, their dental batteries grinding tirelessly against fibrous plants. In South America, the titanosaurs traversed sprawling floodplains, their enormous necks reaching into treetops, consuming foliage that smaller herbivores could not reach. Across every continent, from Asia's interior basins to Africa's semi-arid plateaus, dinosaurs had achieved a level of dominance unmatched in Earth's history. They were apex creatures, not simply in terms of size or strength, but in their ecological reach. The planet's biotic communities were interconnected, flourishing under long-established balances. Predator and prey were locked in evolutionary arms races that had sharpened over millions of years. Tyrannosaurids patrolled the plains of Laramidia, their senses acute, their movements precise. Smaller carnivores prowled the margins, each exploiting ecological niches with remarkable efficiency. Large herbivores moved in organized herds, likely coordinated to maximize protection against these predators. Fossil trackways suggest complex interactions, overlapping paths, synchronous movement, multiple generations traveling together. Nesting colonies dotted the landscape, indicating parental care and extended juvenile survival strategies that few reptiles today could rival. Life was not merely surviving, it was thriving. Despite their size and sophistication, dinosaurs were not uniform. Species varied across latitudes and continents, adapted to local conditions. Polar regions, still warmer than today but subject to months of darkness, hosted specialized forms. Small theropods with insulating feathers navigated winter shadows, while herbivorous species adjusted their foraging strategies to the seasonal availability of vegetation. Even in equatorial zones, competition was fierce. Angiosperm expansion had created patchwork ecosystems offering both opportunity and challenge to those who could exploit it. Flexibility and innovation were as critical to survival as strength and size. The fossil record of this period reveals remarkable diversity. Hundreds of species existed simultaneously across multiple continents. The apparent absence of widespread decline before the very end challenges any narrative of a slow, inevitable extinction. In many regions, dinosaurs reached the apex of ecological sophistication only shortly before their final disappearance. Edmontosaurus, for example, shows evidence of intricate social behaviors and long-distance migrations, possibly moving in response to seasonal resource fluctuations. Titanosaurs, some reaching 70 tons, exemplified the pinnacle of physiological and biomechanical engineering, their hollow bones and extensive air sac systems allowing such enormous forms to persist and thrive. Yet the veneer of security is deceptive. Systems that appear strong often conceal unseen fragilities. A complex, interdependent network can tolerate ordinary fluctuations, but extreme perturbations can propagate shock waves through the system. Dinosaurs had survived multiple global crises, volcanic eruptions, oceanic anoxic events, and climate swings. They had endured millions of years of ecological upheaval and still thrived. This endurance may have lulled them and us into a false sense of permanence. The very specialization that had allowed them to dominate also made them sensitive to sudden, unprecedented disruptions. Geologically, the world was dynamic. Continental drift continued subtly, ocean currents shifted, and volcanic provinces intermittently released gases into the atmosphere. But on the surface, ecosystems exhibited the appearance of stability. Forests were lush, rivers meandered predictably, and herbivore populations seemed steady. Apex predators were well fed. Reproductive cycles functioned without apparent stress. The system was balanced, perfectly adapted to a world that had evolved over millions of years. Yet adaptation has limits. No matter how resilient, every organism and every ecosystem is constrained by physical and biological realities. Diets can only stretch so far. Climate tolerance has boundaries, and even the most sophisticated physiology cannot shield against catastrophic energy inputs from beyond the planet. The more effective a species becomes at exploiting its environment, the more tightly it is bound to the existing conditions. Its strength becomes a subtle vulnerability, invisible until those conditions are shattered. Across the globe, dinosaurs moved in patterns established over millions of years. Nesting grounds were revisited with remarkable fidelity. Herds maintained migratory routes between feeding grounds and water sources. Predators learned the habits of prey, anticipating their movements. Social structures, from cooperative herding to parental care, provided both protection and opportunity. The Earth appeared resilient, a living stage for a flourishing empire. And yet, at the edge of perception, something immense was approaching. Invisible to all eyes, unheralded by any warning, a mountain-sized object traced a precise trajectory through the void. Its path was relentless, 20 kilometers per second. The culmination of cosmic time and chance, an interloper from the solar system's distant past, moving on a collision course with the only world it had ever encountered. For all the power, all the adaptation, all the mastery of land and air, the dinosaurs could not detect it. There were no warning signals in their behavior, no instinctive fear beyond the ordinary vigilance against predators. The world they had dominated, optimized, and refined was about to meet an energy far beyond anything generated on the surface. In the heart of this empire at its peak, life continued as it always had, vibrant, busy, and unaware. And yet the forces beyond the planet's atmosphere were already closing the distance. The systems that had appeared so invulnerable were about to be tested in a way that no adaptation, no evolutionary engineering could withstand. The sky split with a sudden brilliance, a white-hot flare against the blue of a Cretaceous morning. In an instant, a mountain-sized body from the depths of space collided with the Earth, striking what is now the Yucatan Peninsula with a force that dwarfed anything humanity has ever known. The Chicxulub impact delivered energy equivalent to billions of nuclear bombs, concentrated into a single instantaneous explosion. A crater over 180 kilometers wide was carved into the planet's crust. Mountains of rock were vaporized. In seconds, kinetic energy became heat, shock, and fire. The initial shock waves radiated outward, not just through the crust, but through the oceans and atmosphere. Earth's surface shuddered with a violence that had no precedent in the memory of life. Seismic waves circled the globe multiple times. The air itself became a conduit of devastation, carrying a tsunami of pressure that flattened forests thousands of kilometers away. Trees that had stood for centuries snapped as if they were twigs. Animals that had moved unperturbed along rivers and floodplains were thrown into chaos. The ground itself roared beneath their feet. The impact lifted millions of tons of molten rock and dust into the atmosphere. Ejecta rained down, igniting fires across continents. The heat was instantaneous, searing skin, igniting forests and roasting the plains. Across the globe, firestorms swept landscapes in a crescendo of destruction, consuming plant biomass with a ferocity that even the largest herbivores could not outrun. Smoke and soot rose high, mingling with sulfuric aerosols released from vaporized carbonate rocks. The sky darkened, sunlight diminished, temperatures dropped, and a shadow fell over the living world. Within days, the planet entered what scientists now describe as an impact winter. Sunlight barely penetrated the dense atmospheric veil. Photosynthesis collapsed. Plants that relied on sunlight could no longer grow, and herbivores faced starvation. Carnivores followed, their prey disappearing with every passing day. In marine ecosystems, plankton, the base of the oceanic food web, suffered collapse under reduced light and changing chemistry. Food chains fractured. Entire systems, from the smallest insects to the largest land animals, faltered simultaneously. This was not gradual extinction. This was systemic failure on a planetary scale. It was as if Earth itself had been struck in the operating room, its life support systems abruptly switched off. The complex interdependencies that had evolved over tens of millions of years were overwhelmed within weeks. Even the most adaptable species could not recalibrate fast enough to survive the cascade of environmental collapse. Oxygen fluctuations, acid rain, temperature swings, loss of plant productivity. These stresses compounded relentlessly. The fossil record captures the immediacy of this event. Layers rich in iridium, shocked quartz, and spherules mark a single catastrophic moment. Beneath it, a world bustling with life. Above it, silence. Trees petrified in the instant of combustion. Herds preserved in mud and ash. The suddenness is staggering. There is no slow fade. There is no drawn-out decline. Life's intricate networks, perfected over millions of years, failed almost instantaneously. Yet the impact did not annihilate every living thing. Small animals, burrowers, and aquatic creatures in protected refuges persisted. Insects, freshwater fish, certain amphibians, and early mammals endured the initial cataclysm. These survivors were often small-bodied, ecologically flexible, and able to exploit niches overlooked by larger creatures. Their endurance was not a triumph of strength or dominance, but of adaptability, behavior, and sometimes sheer luck. Bird-line dinosaurs, already small and feathered, may have persisted in some form. Mammals that had spent millennia living in the shadow of giant reptiles suddenly found opportunities for expansion. Plants with seeds capable of surviving harsh conditions began the slow recolonization of devastated landscapes. The Earth, though shattered, held a seed of continuity. In the aftermath, the world was unrecognizable. Fire-ravaged plains and forests, acidified oceans, and darkness lingering for months or years reshaped habitats. Ecological hierarchies dissolved. The apex predators and giant herbivores that had ruled continents vanished. Entire evolutionary lineages disappeared in the blink of geological time. Yet through the smoke and ash, through the frozen light and charred soil, some forms endured. The survivors carried forward the memory of the Cretaceous, the tools of adaptation, and the potential to shape a new era. They were small, overlooked, yet essential. In their endurance lay the continuation of life itself. The great age of dinosaurs had ended. Their empires, their diversity, and their astonishing mastery of Earth were extinguished almost overnight. But in the shadows of the catastrophe, life persisted, poised for its next great transformation. What do you think about the extinction of dinosaurs? Share your thoughts in the comments section. The world that emerged from the immediate chaos of the Chicxulub impact was a planet transformed beyond recognition. Forests were blackened skeletons, rivers ran dark with ash and sediment. The oceans churned with chemical imbalance and sunlight-starved plankton. In that darkness, only a select few creatures endured, and among them were the ancestors of birds. These small, feathered dinosaurs, the avialae, had already spent tens of millions of years experimenting with flight, insulation, and metabolic efficiency. Their bodies were light, hollow-boned, and aerodynamically tuned. They had high energy turnover and the capacity for rapid activity despite scarcity. Their small size, often seen as a disadvantage among giants, now became a decisive factor. In a world where food was suddenly limited, where shelter mattered more than strength, their energy-efficient physiology allowed them to survive when even the largest, most dominant creatures perished. Dietary flexibility was another key to endurance. Unlike specialized herbivores or apex predators, these early birds could subsist on seeds, small invertebrates, carrion, or plant matter. When flowering plants failed to bloom due to months of darkness, when herbivorous dinosaurs starved, these opportunists found niches unnoticed by larger competitors. Some may have burrowed or taken refuge in cavities, sheltered from the immediate thermal and environmental extremes. Their survival was not a testament to dominance, but to adaptability. It was not only birds that endured. Crocodilians, survivors of multiple mass extinctions before, persisted through the chaos. Their low metabolic rates, slow growth, and semi-aquatic habits provided insulation against the environmental upheaval. While dinosaurs, especially the giants, required constant sustenance to fuel enormous bodies and high-energy lifestyles, crocodilians could survive long periods without food. Their ability to inhabit rivers, swamps, and estuaries, areas less immediately affected by atmospheric dust and firestorms, allowed populations to maintain continuity even as terrestrial landscapes were devastated. The pattern becomes clear. Survival was rarely about power, intelligence, or dominance. Tyrannosaurs were formidable. Titanosaurs were massive, yet their energy demands and ecological specialization made them particularly vulnerable to a sudden collapse of primary productivity. Small generalist species capable of slowing metabolism, exploiting diverse resources, or seeking shelter endured where giants failed. Energy efficiency, the capacity to maintain life on minimal inputs, became the single most critical trait in this post-impact world. Even among survivors, the distribution of traits was telling. Small mammals thrived in underground burrows, evading both the initial fires and subsequent climatic oscillations. Insects capable of diapause, a state of suspended metabolism, persisted until conditions stabilized. Fish and amphibians in deep lakes or riverbeds escaped the worst of ash fallout and chemical perturbations. Reptiles with versatile ecologies, able to shift diets or habitats quickly, persisted in scattered refuges. The pattern is consistent. Flexibility, low energy requirements, and ecological generalism dictated who would endure. Birds in particular carried forward more than just life. They carried potential. The metabolic machinery that allowed sustained activity in scarce conditions, the flight apparatus that provided mobility across devastated landscapes, and the reproductive strategies favoring small clutches of well-developed offspring created a template for post-extinction success. Within these small ovulands, evolution had already encoded the capacity for radiation into empty niches. They were not dominant in the Cretaceous, but they were survivors in the Paleogene. Crocodilians, too, offered lessons. Their longevity as a lineage, surviving from the Triassic to the present, highlights the enduring value of energy efficiency and ecological resilience. They tolerated fluctuations in sea level, climate, and prey availability over millions of years. Their survival underscores the principle that evolutionary success is not synonymous with size or predation. It is measured in persistence. When we examine the fossil record immediately after the KPG boundary, a striking reality emerges. Life did not vanish entirely. It contracted, redistributed, and reorganized. Survivors were disproportionately small-bodied, ecologically flexible, and metabolically efficient. Plants with seeds resistant to fire and dormancy survived. Microfauna adapted to rapidly changing conditions endured. This selection was not conscious. It was dictated by physics, chemistry, and the energetic constraints imposed by catastrophe. Philosophically, this rewires our understanding of extinction. We often imagine that the strongest survive, that intelligence or cunning secures life. The Cretaceous-Paleogene transition shows us otherwise. Catastrophe operates on universal principles. It does not negotiate with size or beauty. It acts through energy balance, resource availability, and environmental tolerance. Survival is a matter of efficiency, of the capacity to persist through scarcity, not a matter of dominance or fearsome appearance. Yet even this efficiency has limits. Energy-efficient survivors do not escape the need for food, water, and shelter indefinitely. They endure by exploiting niches temporarily empty or buffered from immediate disaster. They persist until conditions stabilize sufficiently for growth and reproduction to resume. In other words, survival is an interplay between organismal design and environmental opportunity. Even the most efficient organisms are bound by the physical realities of their world. As the dust settled and sunlight gradually returned, those small, resilient creatures began the slow recolonization of the devastated planet. Early mammals explored vacant niches. Birds radiated from pockets of survival, evolving into lineages that would eventually give rise to modern forms. Crocodilians resumed their place in river systems. Life, though scarred, endured. The triumph was subtle, quiet, and invisible to the surviving giants who once ruled the continents. We are left to ponder a haunting question. Was the mass extinction inevitable, or merely a consequence of coincidence? A planetary system tipped at precisely the wrong moment. Dinosaurs had survived catastrophic volcanism, oceanic collapse, and climate upheaval for tens of millions of years. Yet a single extraterrestrial strike, amplified by existing stresses, triggered their final undoing. It was not weakness, but timing, not incompetence, but chance. In examining who survived and why, a pattern emerges that transcends this particular event. Life's endurance is dictated not by grandeur but by adaptability, not by dominance but by the ability to conserve energy, exploit flexibility, and weather temporary collapse. The birds and crocodilians remind us that the true measure of survival is subtle, often invisible, and governed by principles older than any lineage. From the ashes of the Cretaceous, these survivors would carry the blueprint for a new world. A world without giants but filled with potential. A world where life could radiate once more into empty ecological space, reshaping the Earth in ways that could not have been imagined by those who had ruled it for over 100 million years. For 165 million years, dinosaurs adapted with relentless precision. They conquered every upheaval that Earth itself could produce. Volcanic winters, ocean anoxia, continental drift, climate oscillations, each challenge sculpted physiology, behavior, and social complexity. They became masters of their domain. Sauropods evolved lungs more efficient than any mammals, their hollow bones and air sacs allowing 70-ton giants to exist without collapsing under their own weight. Predators honed senses, reflexes, and hunting strategies that optimized energy for survival. Small theropods evolved feathers, high metabolisms, and social coordination. They were organisms tuned to Earth's rhythms, honed by repeated stress, resilient to nearly everything this planet could deliver. Yet there was a boundary to that mastery. Evolution operates through iterative selection. Change occurs in response to existing pressures, in relation to environmental cues. Dinosaurs were shaped by fire, flood, and shifting continents. They were not shaped to survive a sudden collision with a celestial body hurtling at tens of kilometers per second. No evolutionary trajectory could anticipate a cosmic strike. No amount of size, speed, or intelligence could prepare them for energy beyond planetary scales. The very mechanisms that allowed them to dominate Earth, gigantism, specialization, dependence on abundant primary productivity, became liabilities in the face of an entirely novel and instantaneous catastrophe. This reveals a profound principle of life. Adaptation is context-dependent. Organisms respond to pressures they have historically experienced, not to hypothetical extremes. What is advantageous under one set of circumstances may be fatal under another. In ecological systems, stability can breed fragility. The more a lineage invests in specialized forms of efficiency, the more it becomes vulnerable to perturbations beyond that scope. Dinosaurs had survived volcanic winters, pluvial episodes, and shifting oceans. They had endured crises that would have crushed lesser organisms. Yet when the impact arrived, it exposed a weakness intrinsic to even the most successful lineage: the inability to anticipate the unprecedented. The Chicxulub event functioned as a planetary reset button. Ecosystems that had taken millions of years to evolve were abruptly collapsed, giving new opportunity to those traits that had previously been marginalized. Small body size, ecological generalism, energy efficiency, and metabolic flexibility. The survivors were often the least dominant, the least conspicuous, yet these traits became the foundation for the next explosion of life. Mass extinctions are not mere endings. They are accelerators of evolution, revealing the hidden architecture of resilience and exposing the limits of adaptation. Philosophically, there is an uncomfortable truth embedded in this pattern. Every lineage carries within it the seed of its vulnerability. The very traits that ensure survival in familiar contexts, gigantism, specialization, dominance, can guarantee failure when conditions shift beyond the historical envelope of selection. Strength is not omnipotence. Efficiency is not omniscience. The record of the dinosaurs demonstrates the fine line between mastery and exposure, between flourishing and collapse. Life is always provisional, a continual negotiation with uncertainty. This reflection extends beyond the ancient past. The extinction of the non-avian dinosaurs is a case study in the boundaries of adaptation. It is not merely about celestial impacts. It is a meditation on fragility, resilience, and the unseen constraints embedded in every complex system. The dinosaurs, for all their power, were confined by the rules of their own evolutionary design. They could survive nearly everything Earth produced, but they could not survive a force that violated the context within which they had been forged. And so the question becomes deeply unsettling. If the greatest and most successful terrestrial lineage in Earth's history could be undone in a matter of weeks, what does that imply for us? What assumptions of permanence, what faith in the predictability of our environment might blind us to vulnerabilities of a scale we have never encountered? Life persists through adaptation, but adaptation has bounds. The mechanisms that carry us through familiar crises may offer little protection against the unprecedented, the catastrophic, or the global. In witnessing the limits of adaptation, we confront both humility and forewarning. Dinosaurs survived for more than 160 million years by bending to the pressures of their world. Yet the moment the universe imposed a challenge beyond their evolutionary imagination, their empire fell. Every lineage, no matter how dominant, contains within it the echo of fragility. Every form of mastery is provisional. Every era of security may be hiding the shape of a threat we cannot yet perceive. And as we look back at the remains of that lost world, we are compelled to ask, if even the mightiest can fall, if adaptation has limits, then how prepared are we for forces beyond the horizon of our experience? How does the story of the dinosaurs inform the fragile architecture of our own survival, perched as we are atop a planet that can still, in a single moment, exceed our capacity to endure? In the quiet aftermath of the cataclysm, when ash clouds lingered and sunlight struggled to pierce the thick veil of dust, a new world emerged. A world shaped less by giants and more by the small and adaptable. Where once colossal sauropods grazed and predators stalked in dominance, now tiny mammals began to explore the ecological spaces that had been suddenly emptied. No longer constrained by the shadow of titans, these survivors took their first tentative steps into niches previously inaccessible. Mammals had existed alongside dinosaurs for millions of years, but they were marginal, nocturnal, and small. The Cretaceous was dominated by forms that specialized in exploiting abundant resources, leaving little room for opportunistic competitors. These early mammals were creatures of restraint, insectivores, omnivores, and opportunists that had survived the initial impact precisely because their size and behavior allowed them to persist through scarcity. Now, with a world reset, these same traits became keys to an expansive evolutionary future. The immediate post-impact landscapes were chaotic but rich in opportunity. Forests regrew slowly, and rivers carried ash and nutrients that fertilized the soil. Insects, which had survived underground or in protected refuges, proliferated, providing abundant prey for small insectivores. Seeds resistant to fire and drought sprouted in pockets, supporting herbivorous species. Mammals that had been confined to limited territories suddenly encountered open ecological space, a realm previously monopolized by dinosaurs. Within a few generations, these creatures began to experiment with size, diet, and behavior in ways that had been impossible before. Nocturnality, once a survival tactic to avoid predation, became a platform for innovation. Creatures that had relied on nighttime activity were pre-adapted to the immediate post-impact conditions when daytime temperatures fluctuated wildly and predators were few, but environmental hazards remained severe. Sensory acuity sharpened. Hearing, smell, and tactile sensitivity guided these animals through landscapes still scarred by fire and ash. Burrowing and sheltering behaviors that had preserved populations during the cataclysm now allowed them to survive in patches of relative stability while exploring the surrounding territories. Diversification proceeded rapidly. Some mammals remained small, perfecting their roles as insectivores, omnivores, or scavengers. Others began to explore larger forms, branching into herbivory and carnivory, where ecological vacancies permitted. The pace of change was extraordinary. Evolutionary pressure, normally measured in slow increments, accelerated under the conditions of a depopulated world. Traits that were previously marginal, extended gestation, parental care, flexible diets, now became foundations for survival and expansion. Within a few million years, mammals were radiating into forms that would, in time, dominate landscapes, rivers, and skies. The vacuum created by the extinction of dinosaurs was essential to this transformation. Dinosaurs, as magnificent as they were, had been so ecologically successful that they constrained potential competitors. Their size, territoriality, and efficiency dominated primary productivity. They left few niches for mammals to explore. It is tempting to imagine an alternate Earth in which dinosaurs had persisted indefinitely. Vast herds of sauropods would have continued to monopolize plant resources, and theropods would have maintained predatory hierarchies. In such a world, the trajectory that led to primates and eventually to humans might never have occurred. The very impact that extinguished the non-avian dinosaurs became a prerequisite for mammalian ascendance. It is remarkable to consider that these small, often overlooked creatures carried within them the seeds of what would become a new terrestrial empire. From nocturnal insectivores arose the first placental mammals. From these emerged lineages that experimented with arboreal life, social structures, and specialized diets. Evolution, which had been constrained by the dominance of dinosaurs for millions of years, now proceeded unhindered. New body plans, reproductive strategies, and behaviors evolved in ways that the pre-extinction world could never have accommodated. Yet while mammals were claiming the ground and exploring forests, the planet still retained echoes of the age that had passed. Birds, the living descendants of theropod dinosaurs, persisted and radiated into a variety of forms. Their evolution during the post-impact era mirrored that of mammals in some ways. Small, adaptable, and energy efficient, they occupied niches left open by extinction. Raptors, early waterfowl, and perching birds exploited habitats that had been shaped by millions of years of dinosaur ecology. In doing so, they carried forward the genetic and physiological legacy of the Cretaceous. In a sense, the story of mammals is inseparable from the story of dinosaurs. The success of the latter constrained the former, and the sudden removal of one created opportunity for the other. Mammals rose not solely because of their inherent advantages, but because the rules of the ecosystem had changed. Extinction reshaped the competitive landscape, demonstrating that evolution is not a matter of inherent superiority, but of timing and circumstance. The interplay between catastrophic loss and ecological opportunity became a defining pattern in the history of life. The rise of mammals also illuminates the principle of ecological release, the idea that the disappearance of dominant forms allows others to explore niches with reduced competition. For the first time, mammals moved beyond the margins, experimenting with diurnal activity, larger body sizes, and more complex behaviors. Arboreal habits emerged, giving rise to primate ancestors. Herbivory expanded with dental innovations supporting the processing of tougher plant material. Carnivorous mammals evolved strategies for hunting in open spaces and dense forests alike. Each adaptation was a response not only to environmental conditions but to the absence of formerly dominant competitors. Through this lens, we begin to see the subtle continuity between the Cretaceous and the Paleogene. Life did not start anew. It carried forward threads of the past. Birds retained the genetic and physiological sophistication of their theropod ancestors. Mammals, once constrained, were now free to exploit new forms of complexity. Energy efficiency, behavioral flexibility, and small size were the traits that ensured continuity, demonstrating that survival is often about subtlety rather than grandeur. And yet, even as mammals claimed the ground and birds the skies, the legacy of the dinosaurs persisted. Feathers, metabolism, nesting behaviors, and social structures continued to echo in the lineages that survived. In birds, the grandeur of the theropods persisted in miniature, a living testament to a lineage that had once dominated continents. Mammals may have been the new masters of terrestrial life, but the world remained imprinted by the evolutionary experiments of the age that had passed. In understanding this transition, we recognize a profound principle. Extinction is not an end, but a transformation. The demise of one empire creates the conditions for another to flourish. The rise of mammals was contingent not merely on inherent capabilities, but on the sudden removal of constraints imposed by dinosaurs. It is a story of opportunity arising from catastrophe, of life reasserting itself in the interstices of devastation. Yet the dinosaurs never truly vanished. In the bodies of birds, in the wings that now cleaved the skies, their story continued. Feathered, agile, and adaptable, they became the quiet custodians of a legacy that once ruled Earth in unimaginable scale. They persisted not as the rulers of continents, but as a reminder that evolution is both resilient and continuous, weaving threads of past and present into a living tapestry. As mammals expanded across forests, plains, and wetlands, the shadow of the age of dinosaurs remained ever present, a silent force shaping the ecological canvas. Without the asteroid, primates may never have emerged. Without the selective pressures of extinction and opportunity, mammals might have remained small and marginal. In the grand sweep of time, the fall of the dinosaurs was the rise of the mammals. A transformation that underscores the intertwined fates of life, chance, and planetary history. And so, as the first mammals explored the new world and birds claimed niches once dominated by giants, one truth endured: extinction reshapes, survival selects, and evolution finds a way. Dinosaurs had receded, but they had not disappeared. In every songbird, every feathered wing, every small, adaptable mammal scuttling beneath the brush, their legacy persisted, waiting for the next chapter of life to unfold. Even now, if you look carefully at the world around you, the dinosaurs are still here. Not as the towering, earth-shaking giants that once roamed the continents, but as creatures adapted to a radically different world. Birds. Every pigeon coasting over a city square, every crow perched on a lamppost, every hummingbird darting between blossoms carries a story that stretches back through millions of years. In their feathers, their bones, and their behaviors, the lineages of non-avian theropods persist, a living testament to evolutionary persistence. Birds are not merely survivors, they are among the most successful vertebrates on the planet today. There are over 10,000 species worldwide, occupying every conceivable terrestrial niche. from the frozen expanses of Antarctica to tropical rainforests, from isolated oceanic islands to sprawling urban centers. The diversity we see today reflects a remarkable capacity for adaptation, experimentation, and exploitation of environments left empty by the mass extinction that ended the reign of the non-avian dinosaurs. Each species represents a branch of an evolutionary tree that has been actively pruning, reshaping, and exploring ecological space for tens of millions of years. Take the urban pigeon, for instance. Often dismissed as a mundane presence, it is a living theropod carrying the DNA of a lineage that once dominated land. Its beak, wings, and skeletal structure are essentially a small, efficient blueprint of its carnivorous ancestors. Its behavior, opportunistic, social, and highly adaptable, mirrors the survival strategies that allowed its predecessors to endure cataclysm. Feeding on scraps, nesting on artificial structures, and navigating chaotic human-dominated landscapes, it embodies the principle that survival is about flexibility, not size or raw power. The same lineage that once faced extinction at the hands of a cosmic impact now thrives in the shadow of towering skyscrapers. A daily demonstration that the evolutionary story of the dinosaurs did not end. It transformed. Modern birds also retain many physiological features inherited from their dinosaur ancestors. Their lungs are highly efficient, incorporating unidirectional airflow that allows for sustained activity with minimal energy loss. Hollow bones reduce body mass while maintaining strength. Feathers, once the domain of display or insulation in the Mesozoic, have been co-opted for flight, thermoregulation, and, in some species, complex signaling. These traits, honed through millions of years, were not engineered for human observation but have proved endlessly versatile in a changing world. Evolutionary innovations that arose under the constraints of pre-impact Earth continue to define ecological success today. Beyond anatomy, the behavior of birds is strikingly sophisticated. Many species exhibit complex social structures, cooperative breeding, and sophisticated foraging strategies. Corvids, for example, demonstrate problem-solving abilities and memory skills that rival those of mammals. Parrots engage in intricate communication and even mimicry, suggesting cognitive capacities that were likely nascent in their dinosaur ancestors. What we witness in these modern birds is the extension of survival strategies developed in a Mesozoic world. Learning, flexibility, and social coordination are as crucial as wings or feathers. They are living reminders that evolutionary success depends on multiple layers of adaptation, from anatomy to behavior to cognition. This modern resurgence underscores a broader principle of life. Extinction does not always mean disappearance, and survival is rarely a final state. What ended the dominance of non-avian dinosaurs 66 million years ago was not a failure of adaptability in the strictest sense. It was the intersection of existing vulnerabilities and an unprecedented external catastrophe. Dinosaurs were masters of terrestrial life for 165 million years because they adapted continuously to Earth's internal pressures. Volcanism, climate swings, shifting continents, and predator-prey dynamics. But they were never evolved to withstand a high-velocity impact from a body from beyond the solar system. Their adaptations were optimized for one set of constraints, not for another. In contrast, the small, mobile, energy-efficient lineages that persisted after the Chicxulub impact were poised to radiate. Birds in particular exemplify the way evolution can transform a lineage into something entirely new without erasing the underlying continuity of ancestry. Flight, once a niche adaptation in small theropods, became a conduit for dispersal across continents and ecological zones. Small body size allowed populations to persist even when resources were scarce. Dietary flexibility enabled exploitation of new food sources as ecosystems recovered. And these survivors leveraged both physiological and behavioral traits honed over millions of years, traits that became critical for survival in a radically altered world. Consider the post-extinction landscapes themselves. Initially, the Earth was a planet of scars, burned forests, ash-laden rivers, and oceans disrupted by chemical imbalance, but these spaces, temporarily emptied of dominant species, offered opportunities for survivors to explore novel ecological strategies. Birds exploited aerial niches, mammals spread across the ground, and both lineages diversified in ways that would have been impossible under the shadow of enormous dinosaurs. Evolution is opportunistic. It does not require foresight, only the capacity to exploit conditions as they arise. In this sense, birds' modern success is as much about the aftermath of catastrophe as it is about the inherent traits they carry. The survival of birds also illustrates the role of contingency in evolution. It is easy to assume that dominance equates to inevitability, that the most powerful creatures, the largest predators, or the most complex anatomies are destined to endure. The Mesozoic record, however, demonstrates otherwise. Non-avian dinosaurs, for all their size, specialization, and power, were undone by a force outside the evolutionary pressures that had shaped them. Birds survived not because they were superior in the context of the Cretaceous, but because they happened to possess traits that aligned with the chaotic aftermath of extinction. Evolution rewards preparedness, but preparedness is always conditional. The implications extend beyond paleontology. The modern dominance of birds, their ubiquity across continents and habitats, shows that survival is rarely absolute. It is adaptive, flexible, and contingent on ecological opportunity. In cities, forests, deserts, and mountains, birds thrive not because they were predestined to survive, but because their physiology and behavior allowed them to exploit niches left by catastrophe. Their success is a continuous experiment, unfolding in real time, revealing both the fragility and the resilience inherent in life. Even as birds continue to flourish, the question remains: what truly ended 165 million years of dinosaur dominance? It was not a slow erosion of adaptation, nor a gradual decline due to internal competition. It was the abrupt intersection of pre-existing vulnerabilities with a planetary-scale shock, a cosmic body striking with unimaginable force, amplifying stresses already present from volcanism, climate shifts, and ecological pressures. The extinction was absolute in its effects on large-bodied, specialized terrestrial species, yet selective in its survivors. The lesson is stark. No level of mastery over a planet guarantees immunity to forces beyond the evolutionary experience of a lineage. And yet within this stark lesson lies a paradox. Dinosaurs did not vanish, they transformed. Their traits, honed over tens of millions of years, found expression in forms that survived and thrived. Flight, feathers, energy efficiency, social behavior, all became tools for navigating a changed world. The lineage endured, reshaped, and recontextualized, proving that extinction is not necessarily annihilation, but transformation. Modern birds are thus a mirror to the past, a living archive of the Mesozoic world. They remind us that evolution is not linear, that survival is contingent, and that continuity can emerge from catastrophe. In their songs, flight, and nesting behaviors, we can trace the echoes of giant predators and sophisticated theropods that once dominated every continent. The pigeons in city streets, the hawks circling above, the hummingbirds weaving through flowers, they are all descendants of an empire thought lost. Their existence challenges our perception of endings. It forces a re-examination of dominance, success, and resilience. Dominance, no matter how complete, is always provisional. Success is always relative to the constraints of the environment, and resilience often lies in the small, flexible, and adaptable rather than the massive, powerful, or awe-inspiring. In this way, the story of the dinosaurs and their transformation into birds carries a profound philosophical resonance. It underscores the limits of mastery, the contingencies of survival, and the invisible threads that link past and present. The creatures we see flying across our cities or nesting in forests are not merely surviving. They are testaments to endurance, adaptability, and the extraordinary persistence of life across unimaginable scales of time and change. And so, as we observe the birds around us, we are confronted with the full scope of their lineage. The rise, the dominion, the sudden collapse, and the quiet, enduring continuation of one of the most remarkable families of animals ever to walk and fly on this planet. Their survival teaches us that endings may be transformed into beginnings, that catastrophe can open pathways for new life, and that the empire of the dinosaurs persists unseen yet profoundly present in every fluttering wing and every song carried across our modern world. Even as we marvel at their presence, the final question lingers. If survival can transform an empire into a lineage no larger than a pigeon, what does that imply about the nature of dominance, the fragility of greatness, and the ways in which life perpetually finds a path forward even after the most absolute of defeats? The dinosaur's story is no longer one of extinction alone. It is a story of persistence, adaptation, and the remarkable capacity of life to endure and evolve. A living testament still here, still soaring above us. 165 million years, a span so vast it almost defies comprehension. Through volcanic eruptions that painted skies red, through shifting continents and oceans that swallowed life whole, through plagues, ice ages, and cyclonic storms, the dinosaurs endured. They adapted to every challenge their planet could present. They evolved wings, feathers, hollow bones, air sac lungs. They mastered energy, social coordination, hunting strategies, and ecological dominance. Their rule was not by accident. It was the product of relentless trial, of refinement over tens of millions of years, of survival honed into an art form that left nothing untested, nothing unchallenged. And yet all of that mastery, all of that sophistication ended in an instant. A single body from beyond the solar system, hurtling at 20 kilometers per second, intersected with the Earth. It was a statistical anomaly, a cosmic event with infinitesimal probability, and yet it happened. The force unleashed was unimaginable. Shockwaves radiating through the crust, tsunamis thousands of kilometers across, heat that ignited forests, debris that blotted out the sun. Photosynthesis collapsed. Global ecosystems imploded. Dinosaurs, for all their mastery of the known pressures of the Earth, could not withstand this unprecedented force. It is crucial to understand the scale of what occurred. This was not a slow attrition. This was not an incremental failure of adaptation. Every defense they had built, every trait selected over millions of years, every strategy that had kept them dominant became irrelevant in the face of an entirely new kind of challenge. Evolution is brilliant, but it is not omniscient. It optimizes for the pressures a species actually experiences. The dinosaurs were not weak. They were exquisitely adapted to an environment that no longer existed. In this sense, their extinction is less a story of failure and more a story of limits. The unavoidable boundaries that every organism carries, hidden within the very traits that ensure its survival under normal circumstances. Life, of course, is remarkable in its persistence. Birds, the small mammals that emerged after the impact, and even the resilient lineages of plants and microbes carried forward the legacy of the past. They illustrate a principle that is both humbling and unsettling. Life can survive nearly everything. Massive volcanic outbursts, anoxic oceans, ice ages, floods, until it encounters a force that exceeds the envelope of its evolutionary experience. Survival is never absolute. It is always conditional, always bounded by the historical contingencies that shaped it. And yet, there is a profound lesson in that conditionality. The story of the dinosaurs reminds us that greatness is provisional, that domination does not equate to invulnerability. The very traits that made them masters, gigantism, specialization, efficient energy use, territorial command, became liabilities under a condition they had never faced. Their extinction was not evidence of weakness, but of circumstance. Adaptation is a fine instrument, but even the most finely tuned cannot predict the improbable, the external, the unprecedented. Now, as the asteroid approached and the world held its fragile balance, there was no awareness, no anticipation. Herds grazed, predators hunted, the air thrummed with the ordinary rhythms of life. And then, the collision. A brilliant white light tore across the sky, momentarily eclipsing the sun, a celestial punctuation that ended an empire in a season. That light, first glimpsed in the quiet grazing of hadrosaurs so long ago, now returns in memory, a reminder of the fragility inherent in even the most dominant forms of life. From this vantage, we see that the story of extinction is inseparable from the story of survival. The line between the two is not drawn by power, size, or intelligence, but by contingency, by probability, and by the unforeseen intersection of life with forces beyond its experience. Every lineage carries within it the ghost of its vulnerability. Every ecosystem contains the seeds of its own restructuring. The dinosaurs' reign was vast, elegant, and almost unfathomable, but it was contingent. Their disappearance illustrates a principle that applies to all complex life. No matter how thoroughly adapted a lineage may appear, there is always a boundary, a threshold beyond which survival is no longer assured, and so we are left with reflection. If the most successful and adaptable large animals in Earth's history could be undone by a single, extraordinarily improbable event, what does that imply about the creatures that dominate today, ourselves included? Human ingenuity, technological mastery, and global influence may provide temporary shields against the pressures of our environment, but we too exist within an evolutionary envelope. We too could encounter a force that exceeds the scope of our preparation, a threat for which no amount of experience, intelligence, or adaptation could suffice. The story of the dinosaurs is a cautionary tale writ in deep time. Survival is never guaranteed, and the most magnificent achievements are always provisional. And yet, within that reflection, there is awe. The dinosaurs endured longer than almost any other lineage of complex life, refining traits that allowed them to thrive under conditions that would have destroyed lesser creatures. They evolved, innovated, and dominated for 165 million years. Their extinction was not a simple failure. It was the sudden intrusion of a challenge for which they were never designed. In this, there is a kind of nobility, a reminder that evolutionary mastery is powerful but finite.